What is the North Star? What are we trying to accomplish, right? Like, so let's just keep it really simple. Like, what I'm trying to accomplish is I would like to be able to take care of my family, and I would like to leave the world better for my child than I found it.
Welcome to Practical Politics, the podcast that takes you inside the room where decisions actually happen. I'm Sabrina Noah, the Lobbyist Lady, bringing you conversations with the people who live and breathe politics and policymaking process. Today, we're going to do something really special. This is my inaugural Practical Politics podcast, and we're combining it with part 2 of the WeedWonks Podcast with my really good friend Jordan Wellington of Strategy 64. When Colorado voters approved Amendment 64 on November 6, 2012, and legalized recreational cannabis, they literally changed the world. And Jordan was there. He was a legislative staffer in the Colorado House of Representatives, helping to legislatively implement the state's voter-approved law. He was then hired as a senior regulatory analyst for the Colorado Marijuana Enforcement Division, where he drafted many of the state regulations governing retail and medical cannabis in Colorado, and throughout the rest of the U.S., that language still exists. For over a decade, he's been shaping laws and regulations, informing public opinion, and guiding governments through the transition from prohibition to regulation. And that's exactly why we're here at Practical Politics, to take you behind the scenes of the practice of lobbying and the room where the decisions get made. Jordan, what are you and your WeedWonks talking about these days?
What we're trying to do here is bridge a little bit of a hybrid of a WeedWonks style conversation about policy that weaves esoteric ideas and technical stuff. Although we didn't get very technical this time. I thought we were maybe more technical last time. And your new podcast, is a little bit more like interview style and a little bit more asking questions that aren't technically policy oriented. And so although it's been a little bit fluid, the goal is to start out with a little bit more of a WeedWonks style and then transition into the stuff that you want to talk about on your podcast or how you want to approach things on your podcast, even though they're going to be similar conversations. And so if I was the quasi host for this part, I'm happy to pass the baton to let you be the quasi host for this segment and get into some of these kinds of ideas about, what it means as a government affairs professional. It's absolutely critical as we enter into what is the next decade of cannabis policy look like. I think we've got to think about the economic viability of the regulatory structures that we've built, which seem to just not fit within what's rational for companies. We need to kind of operate more like a normalized industry and stuff that maybe we could get away with affording, even if it didn't totally make sense 10 years ago. I mean, look around the country with the number of people who've lost their jobs and the devastation that's been wrought. The only, and we've got to remember, all regulatory agencies get all of their funding from the industry. So it's not just industry jobs, it's regulator jobs. And if the overall pie is shrinking or viability of certain things is shrinking, we also need to give our regulators the ability to be more efficient. Regulators don't actually get to make their own to-do list. I think a lot of people forget that. The legislature gives them their to-do list and they're allowed to color in the lines, but they're basically given like a coloring book with the pictures already drawn and they get to color in.
What I think is really interesting to note there is your description of regulators only being able to color within the coloring books, right? I think there's a lot of misunderstanding that regulators may be more, I'll use the funny word, omnipotent than they are. They can only do what they are authorized to do by the law. And often we see a lot of unintended consequences. And I know we hear a lot of that from out of the Western states, right? Our regulators, and there's so much focus on, enforcement, but you can only do what the law allows you to do. So thank you for that.
Quickly though, I think what's really important, just to throw a fine point on that, because I was thinking about it in one direction and you were thinking about it in another direction, right? And I think there's a duality here, right? You were talking about they can only do what the law authorizes them to do, right? Which is totally true. They're constrained by those lines, but also it's not a blank page where they get to draw the picture themselves.
Exactly.
So there are lots of things that they might think are, well, that's kind of stupid. I don't know if we should do that, or that's necessary or efficient. Totally. But they don't have a choice. So they have to do these things. And that in and of itself is super, super critical. So I think that we need to remember that it's kind of both of these things. And it's so important to remember that because, if you're unhappy about something, you've got to complain, right? It's like when you were growing up and you were a kid and you wanted to get something. There was certain questions you'd ask mom and certain questions you'd ask dad or whatever parent structure you have. You knew which parent or authority figure to go ask for a certain thing. Dad might be
Right.
more likely to say yes, like, yeah, we can watch another cartoon and stay up late. Mom might be more likely to say yes to something else. That's at least in my house what happens. Aside, like, so if you've got two parents as a regulated business, that's like kind of in theory the legislature and your regulator. If you start asking your regulator to fix stuff that only the legislature can, you're not only going to be unsuccessful, at some point both of you are going to end up really frustrated. So you got to ask the right parent is, I think, a really kind of interesting way to think about it.
So to quote you as you're talking about the next 10 years, right? Advocates self-identify. Would you say that one of the values I think that we share is a complete support for the regulated market, but understanding the need for evolution? And you, I think, are uniquely situated as coming at it from a patient-centric, consumer-centric model. The goal of these markets is to get safe and reliable cannabis in the hand of consumers, right? Isn't that the point?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's absolutely the point. I think, the way I look at it is maybe that cannabis consumers should have the same civil rights as alcohol consumers. Is kind of
Or tobacco smokers.
Or tobacco smokers or things like that. And so I kind of frame it that way, right? Like if cannabis is no worse than alcohol, which I think is pretty easy to say, it's a lot safer than alcohol. That's why we're here. That's why I do a lot of things that we do. Then why should someone who consumes cannabis be treated differently under the law?
Absolutely.
And so I think, yes, one of those aspects of the law is access to safe and regulated products. Because alcohol consumers have access to safe and regulated products. You don't think you're going to go in to a liquor store and buy something that's going to, was it like moonshine used to cause blindness and stuff like that or whatever it was, like, right? Like you're not worried about those things. Cannabis consumers should be the same way. They should be able to go in and purchase a product, but it's so much more than that. Like that's almost like part of the problem of where we're at today, right? Which is we have these, what I call a liquor store only model. Right. And I always say, like, we got to start from the idea that, like, imagine we closed all bars and took away all restaurants on-premise consumption. And there was no on-premise consumption of alcohol. That's the world that the cannabis consumer lives in. So if you think about it from a question of civil rights, well, participation in society and socialization and community are core aspects of civil rights and rights that people should have. And so cannabis consumers should be able to socialize. Do we treat cannabis consumption the same way when it comes to as alcohol as it comes to employment, right? I mean, how can you have the same civil rights if you don't have the same employment rights? Even
custody rights.
That was, I was saying, parental rights are even more important when
housing rights.
When Child Protective Services comes and does an investigation because there's been an allegation of child abuse, which I literally know parent advocates of medical cannabis patients have been investigated many, many times across this country. Are they looking at cannabis use the same way they are looking at alcohol use? Now, if you want to say, well, you're smoking cannabis and that creates a different risk exposure, like, sure, of course. But I think that when you look at what drives me and what I think should be driving the work that we are all doing, it's that. It's are we making, one, are we kind of moving forward and ending the drug war? Because that's a horrific thing that ruins people's lives. Are we creating a situation where people who consume cannabis are treated like normal everyday citizens? Are businesses treated like normal businesses that produce jobs and help people live nice lives? And I think absolutely where we started is, consumers should have access to safe products, that regulated markets should provide cannabis consumers with access to a product that they should be allowed to consume at their own discretion. And that discretion should mean, and the government's job is to make sure that they can do that safely, the same way they do with people who want to consume alcohol or any other food or other human consumable. Like it's
absolutely,
the magic is in the plant, not in the rules.
I think one of the things we're going to spend a lot of time talking about in the next 10 years is how do we help bridge the gap between commercial businesses, commercial CPG, hospitality, retail. How do we introduce them into this massive market of the cannabinoid consumer, right? The cannabis consumer is in itself a massive buying power. And how do we activate that outside of the traditional marketing tactics that we are seeing right now, which are not very, are demographically very narrow towards young men of a certain age, right? Under the age of 35. There's very little marketing focus on anybody over the age of 35. There are absolute bright spots. But to your point, all of this theme as we're getting ready for Canra, as we're getting ready to go into a double header also with INCBA, which I think you've got a huge part and role in as well. And I'm super excited to be speaking. It's this opportunity in Denver, one of our historical states that was such a leader in early regulation. You were there. It's so important to bring all those people together and talk about those best practices and how we can move the industry forward. Because the one thing that we've learned, the industry may be changing. You've talked about the financial constraints, the modifications, the maturation. We're still dealing with the financial inconsistencies of being not given access to traditional financial tools, which is a whole other conversation. But we do have this huge consumer base that we should be exporting. And so I'm really excited to hear your presentation and all of the thoughts that are going to be coming around. Are anything you're excited for INCBA as well?
Yeah, and maybe this is a good kind of pivot to getting back to where we left off on the last podcast, because theoretically as good podcast hosts, we should do that. Although we can do whatever we want. That's the beauty of the podcast. But yeah, I mean, my podcast is going to be kind of about some of the stuff that we've talked about, is what is the next 10 years. So we've got a really cool, my panel at INCBA is about the next 10 years. So we've got a really interesting lineup of speakers and panelists. Jason Addlestone, who deals with, he's an expert in international cannabis policy. David Culver from USCR, who's a federal expert. David Valancourt from the GMP Collective and the S3 Collective, which is really focused on standards. And then Rihanna Durrett, who's the UNLV, the chair of UNLV's Cannabis Policy Institute and on the Cannabis Control Board in Nevada. And so we're going to kind of talk about hospitality and gaming and how that kind of idea completes the market, if you will, and how that market necessarily then needs to have national standards and kind of consistency between states, which is kind of critical to actually establishing federal policy in a national market, which is critical for cannabis businesses to be able to enter international markets. So the policy is really going to the conversation is trying to build on this idea of we've got to take all of these different steps to really 10 years from now end up where we want to be. But I think your panel is also particularly interesting because it's the story of legacy to legal, right? With an amazing group of folks. And that's we are really good fake AM radio hosts segue to where we left off. So why don't we talk a little bit about legacy to legal and your journey from legacy to legal? Ooh, look at that.
Ooh, look at us.
Almost like we're professionals.
We're getting there, Jordan. We're getting there. We're going to have to do more of this co-hosting. I have a feeling this isn't the last time we're going to be doing this. The legacy to legal panel is wonderful. We've got representatives from Normal, early law groups like the Rudick Law Group, Joseph Bondi over at Normal, Ian Sieb from the state of Colorado, who at the time was, one of the foremost consultants within the space, early operators and advocates. So it's really going to be focusing on where were we and how did we get to where we are today, which is important as we prepare to figure out where we are going forward. There's going to need to be some conversations about what has to change. And I think this panel will illustrate that we are at this evolutionary moment. So it's nice to kind of see and remember what were those aligning characteristics, those core values, those commonalities that we all agreed consistently for the last 10 years that got us here. Yeah,
it's going to be a heck of a week. Really, really excited, to say the least.
I'm packing a lot of electrolytes.
That's good. You should probably do that. I'm going to try to sleep maybe after the week. I'm speaking of music, convinced myself I'm going to make it out Tuesday night for a concert in the middle of all of this, maybe for an hour or two, just to clear my head. But we could talk about that later. We'll maybe throw that out there. But where we left off on the last podcast, I think, is really perfect in terms of the legacy to legal moment, because we kind of left off in terms of your story. And I think, your story is really relevant to all of this stuff in terms of kind of the journey and when you went from Moxie to Cresco, which is one of, the amazing large companies that have been built in the cannabis industry. And I'm a big believer that this industry will have big businesses, like you said, and medium-sized businesses and small businesses. And it's not about one thing being good or bad. There's probably, good and bad small businesses, good and bad big businesses. But I want people to have jobs in cannabis. I want people to be employed. I want people to be able to take care of their family. And Cresco's done that for a lot of people over many, many years. And that's a really important thing. And so you were able to help that company really build and grow. And so, what I'd love to talk a little bit about is your journey there and how your role in government affairs gave you an opportunity to change hearts and minds about cannabis in state after state and locality after locality, helping Cresco, which was in many ways, engaged heavily in federal cannabis policy reform, flipping states from prohibition to medical or medical to adult use, and then taking towns that were maybe on the fence and saying, no, you can welcome a cannabis business here. And that was a huge part of what you did. And everybody can run around and be like, well, that was just to help, the company make money. And it's like, well, yeah, it's America. Like, sorry, that's how the system works. But like, these things also wouldn't have happened but for this. And this opened the door for you to talk to people and change so many people's hearts and minds and perspectives and thoughts. And I'd love to kind of hear about that part of the journey, because that really is the underlying reason why all this stuff matters so much.
When I left Moxie in 2018, it was right after the green rush catastrophe that was the first and second quarter of 2018. Moxie was in really big trouble. Most of our corporate level staff had been foregoing paychecks at this point for over almost a year. And I had the opportunity to meet the Cresco team as part of our Pennsylvania growth project under the Pureprint brand with the wonderful Perlo family out in Pittsburgh. I just started texting Charlie Boctella, the CEO and co-founder, and then COO David Ellis, as we were building our co-manufacturing facilities. And David Ellis, as we got to know each other, started ending his text messages with this really funny little saying of, when are you coming to Cresco? And I thought he was just being funny for the first few times. And then it keeps going. And then I finally have a really serious conversation with him. What's interesting, Jordan, is when I moved to Cresco, I actually joined the operations team as the vice president of new market integration. I had carved out at Moxie the intersection of operations, government affairs, licensing, external affairs, really about how you enter a new space and rapidly develop for expansion, because that was the name of the game, right? First on the ground, get your doors open, get your products out, right? Because it was just, that's the speed at which we were moving. So for the first year at Cresco, I was actually a member of the operations team, helping to expand. We went from 1 to 2 to 5 to 7 to 10 states. And I think about 18 months through both application and mergers and acquisitions. It was a pace unlike anything I've ever experienced in my life, which is the Cresco opportunity. And during that time, I was given this front row seat to what it's like to have resources, commitment, and the opportunity to make a lot of quick changes. One of the best opportunities about being at Cresco during this rapid expansion period of time was the resources that were allocated towards market expansion in both medicinal and recreational markets. I certainly got negative feedback from my community. And I unfortunately remind people, when I left Moxie, I actually left a family business. My cousin is the co-founder of Moxie. We grew up 6 houses apart. I just saw him this last weekend at my sister's baby shower. We're very close. And so when I chose to leave Moxie, I left a family business. I left a community that I had been a leader in. And there was a lot of hard feelings about me leaving California to go help the corporate giants of Chicago. At the time, I don't think I really understood their perspective because I was so excited to go and get to do hard things and continue to grow as a professional. And most importantly, to expand access to medicinal cannabis. And with the resources and the support that Charlie invested in, we helped turn 23 legislative packages in 10 legislative cycles, right? That were able to expand the market and access for both medicinal and recreational.
It's amazing how many people who don't know you have strong opinions about you. I guess that's part of politics, which is why I try to stay out of it to the extent I can. But, we've got to go back to where we were talking about before. Like, what is the North Star? What are we trying to accomplish? Right?
Yeah.
Like, so let's just keep it really simple. Like, what I'm trying to accomplish is I would like to be able to take care of my family, and I would like to leave the world better for my child than I found it. That's like pretty simple and straightforward. It's not easy, especially this day and age. I think it's incredibly difficult. But like, if those are what my goals are, okay, well, I'm trying to leave the world better for my child. I think that if I can help in small ways, support in a much broader movement, the end of the drug war, the removal of, criminal provisions against cannabis consumers, having cannabis consumers have the same civil rights as alcohol consumers. I don't think that I'm the linchpin to all of that, nor do I think that I am like, that is the only way that you can make an impact and make the world a better place. In my reality, that's what I'm able to help with, what I'm able to do, and where I think I can add value to a movement that's filled with thought leaders and everything else. The idea that a company like Cresco is a bad guy, like, is so reductive, and it's ridiculous, right? Like, I mean,
it is.
They're not a bad guy. First of all, this isn't fucking comic books. There's not good guys and bad guys. Like, the world is 99.99999% of the world is far more complicated than for reductive comic book level reasoning. Yes, there are some people who are probably like kind of super villains or awful human beings out there. I'm not suggesting they aren't, but like, most things in life are good and bad. And in this instance, you were able to work at a very large scale company that people might complain about. But the truth is that company invested significant resources in in helping address cannabis prohibition. Were there certain ways where they were self-interested about what the market might look like afterwards? I'm sure they were, and I'm sure other people who feel as though they were incredibly altruistic also happen to align with their own personal financial benefits. But putting that aside, but for those efforts, cannabis policy would not have moved as far as it did. And I think that doesn't absolve people from good or bad behavior. But at the end of the day, we also need to recognize how much progress has been made and the pathways through that progress and the contributions to it. And so this idea of reductively referring to things as good and bad is ridiculous. Like, Cresco afforded you a massive opportunity. It provides products to patients all over the country. It has businesses. It gives people jobs. People can take pot shots at literally anything this day and age. But the truth is, it's pretty straightforward if you ask me. If the goal is to end the drug war, if the goal is to provide cannabis consumers with the ability to participate in civil society and have normal civil rights, the work you did at Cresco advances us towards those goals in a critical way. And that without those kinds of investments, there's no way we would have been as far as we are. And so I think it is. I think it's an awesome part of your journey. And I think it's a really important part of the story because, look, when Colorado did this in 2013, like when Amendment 64 passed in 2012, it was Colorado and Washington. And everyone was like, those crazy West Mountain folk, like, what are they doing? Right. And then some other states come along and some other states mattered. But again, it was like Nevada and Arizona and like California. And as someone who grew up on the East Coast, I can tell you East Coast people can very easily dismiss something as wacky West Coast people. Oh, those people in the mountains, that's not real. Oh, California. Yeah, but California is California. They're different than everything else, right? Like, when you're able to take that and move something like that through Illinois, through places like New Jersey and New York and Maryland and some of these other eastern states, it's critical because we are a regional country. There are differences. There are perception issues. And whether those perceptions are fair or right or wrong, they exist. And the goal, again, and I know I'm going on a long diatribe, but I think it's important. Again, the goal is to end the drug war. The goal is to reduce the persecution of the cannabis community. Great. These things help that, and they're critical.
And the goal is to take care of the patients, right? And to go back to my journey, the reason I'm here is because the people behind me, right? The N and the R and the M in my firm represent the family members that have been affected by cancer and ultimately started my journey. And every decision I made at Cresco is this good for patients? Is this aligned? And it was wonderful at Cresco because the corporate values aligned with what's good for patients. And that's what's so exciting about this opportunity. So we're coming on the cusp of this rapid growth expansion in 2019 and 2020. We have tremendous success at state legislature. And now we're ready to tackle post the Biden administration, the next challenge, which is the federal administration. So as we are getting these teams in place at Cresco, I had the wonderful opportunity to work with a team that covered all 50 states. It was, again, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to provide input and feedback and have access through this entire domestic market and really always be pushing best practices, always be pushing patient rights. Just phenomenal. So we're coming off this wonderful success at the state level and expansion, and now we've decided to turn our sights towards Washington. Cresco provided the opportunity to get on the ground in DC and really carve out resources and support for getting these final federal fixes over the hurdle. What I want to make sure folks understand about the way that DC and the federal legislative work that Cresco sponsored alongside our great friends at Curaleaf and Columbia Care and Verano, all of the folks over at Attach and USCR, Cresco was a huge thought leader and invested directly. I got to spend 2 to 3 days a week in DC setting up coalition meetings, helping to facilitate congressional and Senate meetings. We had the first Senate banking hearing on SAFER, which was just a monumental accomplishment. We had huge alignment within the congressional caucus. But DC being DC, it's a really hard place to get things done. And cannabis reform for us is our primary goal, and that's why we were there. But unfortunately, given the unique situation of DC, we could not get the support of the Senate leadership to get it over the hump, to get into the final pieces of legislation in 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023.
Yeah, well,
All right.
I mean, first of all, I'm just going to say thank you because I do not really deal with federal politics. I'm starting a journey on a federal policy project. I've done a little bit of federal policy stuff, talked to some folks in D.C., but I focus mostly on state policy. It just feels like it's a little bit more of the details, a little bit more words on the page and less feelings, whereas federal level feels like it's a lot of Yankees and Red Sox and everything, and it's seen through this prism of like the eternal war between the Republicans and Democrats. And while I have my own personal political beliefs, it's just not what I'm best at. And so I really appreciate and admire the folks who have the patience to deal with that stuff, because I don't think I do, quite frankly. It's like we should end cannabis prohibition and we should not be a political football in this eternal battle that they have between each other. Even if I have my own preferences on policy and sides, it seems like we shouldn't. And that's not how, and my opinion doesn't matter. Like this is how it works. This is how the game is played. This is what it is. And I have a lot of admiration for the folks who are willing to tolerate it and play that game and have an impact, because as much as I wish the game was different and I might have thoughts about how to make it better, it's like, well, that's nice, but this is what it is and this is how it works. And like, as much as you want to make change, like you have to make change. Even if you want to change the system, you have to make change from the system from within. We're still not there, I think, is the other part, right? Like, we made a huge amount of progress in DC. Doesn't mean we've gotten over the finish line, but like, that's not how this works, right? And I think that what we're seeing at the federal level is a lot of frustration, but like, this is not abnormal that it takes time for these things to pass. And it takes people who might feel like they're beating their head against a brick wall. And I think that's some of what you guys have done at the federal level, which is made an enormous amount of progress despite not getting anything over the finish line, which is incredibly trying.
What I love to tell people is I think there was a lot of misconceptions about what like DC looks like. Everyone has this like, thank you for smoking, or is it thank you for smoking, the movie? This perception. There's always, I love that comment when I tell people I'm a lobbyist, right? You have to be very proud to say that word because there's so much misconceptions, right? When you see that movie, right? We sit in bars, we smoke, we do all of these, kind of egregious, worst types of adult type behaviors. But the lobbyists that I know that I spent time with in DC, it's hard work. It's 40, 60, 80, 100 hours of work for a 15-minute meeting because you get one shot, right? And you have to read so many different factors in the moment and ahead. You have to do your homework. You have to be a communicator and a coalition builder, right? That's one of the best parts of the work that Cresco and all of the trade associations and all of the cannabis companies did is we brought the coalition to DC. And that was one of my most exciting days, is getting to reach back out through that network of the last 13 years of everybody that I had touched and activate them in very specific days, right? We're trying to make movement on a specific senator in New Hampshire. We're trying to make movement with a specific congresswoman in Arizona. And being able to go to the community, that is what makes cannabis so cool, and activate those individual business operators, not just the big MSO CEOs, not just lobbyists, right? The number of meetings that I personally led and conducted versus those that I facilitated is 50 to 1. My job's not to be the voice for everyone. My job is to find the right voice for that moment. And that's a lot of hard work. And that takes a lot of money and energy and patience and communication. And that's what I think people don't understand about DC. DC, yes, there are dinners and people do drink, just like they do in every other state, right? But what you don't see is how much work is getting done in the communication in those dinners, in those side conversations, in those moments when everybody else is paying attention to somebody else for the first time all day. And you can look over at your neighbor and just have a moment of, can we fix this? Are we on the same page? I get chills just thinking about it. That's what DC is. It's coalition building at its core, but on a really big scale. And I was privileged to get to do the work. I was privileged to get to represent patients. I was privileged to get to remember that the reason that I get to do this work is because somebody in my life, and myself now as a cancer patient, was positively improved by cannabis. And I get to tell people about that. That's my job. I don't know if there's a better day than a day in DC talking to somebody about that. So again, really grateful to Cresco, and please keep supporting those teams. I know in my digital assets work and many of our friends, like, that work is still ongoing and does require individual personal contribution. And it's not just monetary, right? It's being out there talking about your cannabis business, about your cannabis journey, normalizing and professionalizing that you can look like us and still be a consumer. That's how individuals can participate. So thanks, Jordan.
Yeah. So one of the things that you mentioned, and I think it's maybe really important, is like this idea of this is where I'm supposed to be, right? And for you, that took you through congressional offices and meetings with governors and all of these other things, and meeting with fancy people in fancy places wearing fancy clothes. That was part of it. The other part of it that I think you're kind of sharing and focusing on is this idea of, you know, the work of a lobbyist, or the work of lobbying to change laws as a coalition builder, which I think is almost the opposite at times of what people think a lobbyist is, right? Like, people think of a lobbyist as willing to say anything, lie, cheat, steal, and do whatever they can, manipulate to get people to convince a legislator to do something that may not be the right thing to do. And there are certainly people who do that kind of stuff, and there's some shadiness around there. But coalition building is about empathy and authenticity, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I think that if you're talking about getting, a cannabis patient to feel comfortable to go talk to an elected official, whether that's in DC or in their home state, a state elected official, or even meeting your congressional representative at their office in their district when they're home in the off season, that requires authenticity. That requires empathy, understanding where people are at, understanding how they can be valuable, understanding where that policymaker is, right? I need to connect person A with person B. To do that, you need to understand who they are and who they're going to react to and what the stories they need to hear are. And then to get that advocate to kind of participate in the process, you have to be authentic.
I think that's the best part about being a lobbyist. And I agree with the trope, right? I agree that there are people that collect meetings like trophies, right? Oh, I got this meeting or I did that meeting. But the best lobbyists, the lobbyists I've had the privilege to work with, know that they themselves are not the best messengers. Our job is to be translators and coalition builders and to be strategy experts, right? I think the best lobbyists understand that they are not always the right voice. They are sometimes, right? And that we do become experts and we do have specialties and we do have legislators that we connect with, but not one person fits everything. And I carried the industry that I came from with me into every single meeting, understanding that there is a lot of, it's the world, it's humanity, right? People like to talk about you and gossip, and I have a strength because I know why I'm doing this, right? I am doing this because patients need this medicine, and I am tired of people telling me that they shouldn't have access to it. And when you come from that center of gravity of force, I have been an operator in a legacy company. I have fought and taken, lost bank accounts. I'm not scared to do I'm not scared to ask anybody anything. The answer to any question you never ask is no, right? So I'm privileged to represent every cannabis person in my network, every operator, big, medium, and small. And when I say represent them, that means putting them in the right place at the right time with the right message. And that's where my artwork comes in. That's where my strategy. And so, yeah, I think the best federal, state, municipal, any lobbyist is in themselves a hype man for their client. And the best opportunity is when you can find a way to match your corporate values to your personal values, which is what we are doing over now at NRM Consulting. So it was a really beautiful time, Jordan. We got a lot done, and we're not done yet, but we're definitely getting closer. But we are enjoying building NRM Consulting with an expanded focus on all emerging markets, right? One of the things that I learned in DC is that the things that we're trying to get accomplished from a coalition building perspective, whether it's expanding financial access for emerging markets, whether it's supporting patients' rights and access, there's a lot of industries that need help with that type of communication work. So as I'm coming on the other side of my cannabis journey and understanding that we've got a new administration and a new direction, and we are still fighting for DC, I took the great inflection moment with great support of friends like you, Jordan, to reopen NRM Consulting with a focus on helping people understand the humanity behind lobbyists, because I want to focus on the individuals that are in the room, having the conversations, doing the work. I think people will have a better understanding of what's going on in DC if they talk to those people rather than just listening to pundits reading talking points on television shows. So we are going to be interviewing amazing government affairs professionals like yourself and really helping to explain to everyone that they can be a lobbyist too, and they can contribute in their own community. I want to show that lobbyists are people too, Jordan.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's so funny. One of the things that comes up a lot in my work is people complain and they're like, well, I want to change this law. I'm like, all right, well, this is what it costs to do that. You can hire me, you can hire someone else. We don't really do a lot of lobbying, direct lobbying anymore anyway. But, people complain. They're like, well, that's bullshit. This is democracy. I shouldn't have to hire a lobbyist to change policy. And I just want to be very clear with everybody. You don't.
You don't.
You hire them so you don't have to put up with the government yourself, right? You hire them because it takes a ton of time and expertise and patience to accomplish these changes, and dealing with the legislature and the political process can be miserable for a lot of people. And so you're actually hiring them so you don't have to put up with it. Because sometimes I feel like our government, when you get involved in the belly of the beast, it's like, what's the state capitol like? What's this really like? And I'm like, well, take middle school and remember your middle school experience and take all the good parts about middle school out, to the extent that there are good parts about being 13 years old in America, which is very complicated for most people. And then that's how we run the government. It's the worst parts of middle school is how we run the government. And now understand you're hired a lobbyist because they're willing to tolerate the worst parts of middle school when you don't have to. So you can go change it. I've seen lots of people volunteer and change laws. But it helps to have a lobbyist because, one, it's a profession and it's something that you learn through apprenticeship. It's not something you can go to school and learn. Every person who's good at government affairs learns through apprenticeship, through having mentors and practice. And then also because some of it's miserable and involves stuff that people don't want to do. And so you hire somebody. So I think it is good because, there are lobbyists who maybe, need a moral lobotomy. But most of them are really good people who got into this profession for one reason or another and really do have a really good moral center that they are trying to change the world for a better place. So I appreciate getting some humanity in there. And I'll be a humanity guinea pig for you, if that's a turn of a phrase.
When we last left off, you were explaining to us, Jersey born and bred, very, very proud. You had just taken this, how about you co-opted a job in the legislature? Colorado changes the world.
Ass backwards into a job at the legislature is probably a more, I demanded that my friend Ian let me show up and work for free. Because I couldn't sit in my house any longer, is probably a better way to put it. But yeah, sure. I co-opted a job, whatever word you want to use, as long as...
That's a good lobbyist.
I'm giving you a good word. Fell backwards into it's probably a good Jordan way to think about it, but for sure.
Fell backwards into one of the most important pieces of legislation that changes. And now you're tasked with taking legislation and making it actually function into a business, right? You have to now implement this on going back to our earlier discussion about you've got to either draw the coloring book or figure out how to color in the coloring book. Walk us through what that felt like.
Well, first of all, it felt like comeuppance in a lot of ways. Throughout implementation of Amendment 64, we'd always be confronted with a "and then what" moment. And in probably about 70 to 80% of the cases, all the people at the state legislature were like, well, we'll just kick that to the regulators and make them figure it out. We just passed the ball down the field and it was someone else's problem.
Definitely never done that.
My dumbass then took the job at the Regulatory Association and realized, oh, fuck, I just passed the ball to myself. So I was a bit like, all this stuff I thought was going to be someone else's problem, that I was just passing the ball down the field and they'll worry about it. Nope, actually I was passing the ball to myself. So I was kind of like, oh shoot. But one of the things that you mentioned is when was your what you called your big kid moment, or your framing of oh my God, this is where I'm supposed to be. So yeah, first of all, to understand how unbelievably terrified I was at this stage of my life. We can't start the framing of my mindset without talking about this. I graduated law school in May of 2009 during the biggest explosion in economic history of my lifetime, probably, or at least my adult lifetime. I'd managed to rack up probably a good cool $250,000 in law school debt and student loans that was crushing myself and my family. I was commuting 6 hours a day on the train back and forth from North Jersey to Trenton just so I could see my wife in the evenings for a half an hour before I'd go to bed. And my wife and I, we were so miserable, we just quit our jobs and ran away to Colorado. So I was terrified. I didn't have a job. I could barely afford to live my life. My family was not wealthy by any means. And my mom worked at the JCC running programs for kids with developmental disabilities, which was a lot of my background before law school. And I was just terrified that this crazy risk and leap of faith that I had taken was going to blow up in my face and blow up in my family's face, so that was the reality that I was living in. And I moved to Colorado, and my wife was fortunate enough to find a job at Wings Over the Rockies, making probably a cool $30,000 a year. So that wasn't exactly keeping us housed and sheltered and fed in any way. And I didn't get the jobs I was looking for. And I showed up working for the legislature, basically not getting paid. I was getting paid a little bit of money, but it was $400 a week. It wasn't exactly $400 a week at that point in my life was enough if I didn't have to pay taxes to pay my student loans. Not a penny more. And since the government takes a third of everything you make or more, literally, really, things were tight, and I was terrified. So when I started, even doing this kind of quasi-volunteer work at the legislature, it was I just hope I can find a job that will let me pay my bills. And the idea of being able to start a family or even ever pay off my student loans before I died was like a pipe dream that I never thought would be real. So even while I was running implementation of legalization at the legislature, I had no idea the gravity of what I was doing. I was just terrified. I just worked all day, every day, as hard as I could to be as helpful as I could to everybody around me, to show the people in the Colorado policy community that I was smart and hardworking and helpful. And I'll never forget it. Like, so the legislature ends on Wednesday, and we go to Sine Die, and I start talking about potentially going to work at the MED. And that Friday night, I went out to dinner with my wife at a restaurant in Uptown called Steuben's. And I'm walking out of this restaurant, Steuben's, which has been in Colorado since we moved here and something we went to a million times and became a really important place. And as I'm walking in to the restaurant, I'm walking past this gentleman by Jesse Ulibarri, who was a state senator, just absolutely amazing guy. Like, just one of these people that you meet in politics and is just smart and hardworking, and his head and his heart are in the right place. Just awesome. I was like, this guy is like as cool as can be in my mind. And as we're walking, he probably doesn't even remember this because it was like a 90-second exchange. And he's like, Jordan, it's so good to see you, man. And I'm like sitting there being like, this guy even knows who I am. It's wild. And he's like, you're the pot guy. And I'm like, oh dear God, like, please don't fucking say that. Like, first of all, I have all this like anxiety of being like a cannabis consumer in the 90s in high school and college, where people would be like, you're stupid because you're a stoner, and all those stoner archetypes that were foisted upon us. So like the idea of being a cannabis consumer and being an out cannabis consumer was very stressful for me because I wanted to be perceived as employable. And like one of the tropes about cannabis people is that they're not employable. And I was like, well, I really need to be employable because I really need to be able to like pay my bills and pay my rent. And I was like, please don't call me that. Like, I need a job. Like, I need to be able to take care of my family. And he's like, do you have any idea what you just did? Do you have any idea what you just accomplished? And I'm like, well, I just really want to not have to move back to New Jersey, like, for the love of God. And he's like, no, man. He's like, you like implemented like legalization of cannabis. Like, do you have any idea what you just accomplished? Like, this isn't bad. You're the pot guy. Like, this is amazing. And this is really important and impactful. Because that was the moment where I was like, oh man, I did do something cool. Like, this is a big deal. Like, holy shit. Like, okay, cool. That's awesome. But still terrified. And dear God, I just hope I could get a job so I could just pay my rent. It was having a state senator look at me and be like, you oblivious dumbass. Like, do you have any idea like what you just accomplished? Because apparently you're like trying to run from this thing and like worried about it. And meanwhile, and I was like, oh man, that was pretty cool. Like, snap, like that was fucking sweet. Like, wow, you know? And then I went into the belly of the beast at the MED and got to work with amazing people working on all the administrative regulations and technical fun nerdy stuff that states that continue to talk about how terrible Colorado did copy and paste into their regulatory architecture, which is my favorite future part. Is the people who talk smack about Colorado, and then I can go into their rules and be like, yeah, but I remember writing that sentence with Lewis and Ron 10 years ago, so we couldn't have done that bad of a job if they're still copying all these words that we wrote.
And I think that for our listeners, if you really want to get a really up and close personal of the impact of those deep dives on those technical aspects, please make sure that you listen over to the WeedWonks podcast with Jordan, and he gets into that on a very, very amazing basis, and he makes it very fun and interesting to listen to. So Jordan, one of my favorite things to ask guests is, now you've accepted, right? You are right where you're supposed to be. You are at where preparation and opportunity have come together. What did your mom say when you said, I'm now the pot guy?
She fucking laughed in my face, like the rest of my friends. You know, I don't remember exactly what probably my mom was thinking, like, dear God, like, you know, like, this better work. Because, you know, no, I mean, look, I'm really lucky. I have an amazing mom. I have an amazing relationship with my mother. She's just a fantastic person. She's also uniquely skilled at guilt tripping people. My mom is half Jewish and half Italian, the two cultures I think that are like genetically programmed at like infusing crushing guilt into their children unintentionally. My mom's like would freak out if she heard this, but fortunately she doesn't. She's sick of hearing my voice, so she probably won't listen. But when I told her, she was just like, you know, she thought it was awesome and she was incredibly proud.
And I think one of the things I'm excited to hear about next, right? You've changed the world as that legislator, as the pot guy said. And now here we are 10 years into regulated industry. and you're working on the next innovation in our regulatory environment, right? One of the things I think your brand, and as we've talked about extensively, your commitment to patients, consumers, and quality product, is this is about access, right? So what's next? What are you working on right now that's that next phase of innovation?
I mean, you know, first and foremost, I'm working on keeping a small business alive in a struggling cannabis economy that employs the people who work here. You know, I mean, I hate to be kind of super basic about it, but you know, when you're the boss, you wake up every day with the responsibility of paydays at the end of the month, and it's my job to make sure everyone at the company gets paid, because all the other cool stuff doesn't happen without that, right? You know, in terms of the things that I'm excited I'm working on, I always to this day will always continue talking about cannabis hospitality and any chance I can get and any framework I can get. Doing some really cool stuff with my friend Chris Laporte out in Las Vegas, trying to get this crazy real estate project off the ground that would be a really interesting, you know, kind of step forward in cannabis hospitality, and continue driving home the message, one, that we do not have true legalization, right? We have not fulfilled the promise of Amendment 64 and the world that we want to create, the world that Steve envisioned and everything else. Like, we have a liquor store only model. And it's super cool that the state of Colorado has agreed that people who consume cannabis should not be put in cages and that they should have access to safe and regulated product through stores. But they also have not agreed that I'm allowed to leave my house and consume it. But, you know, everywhere you go, you can buy alcohol. So, you know,
the community
step
aspect
one
is important.
If marijuana is safer than alcohol, and therefore why are we treating people who consume it differently? You know, that age-old question that Stephen Mason drove home day in and day out here. To me, that means to fulfill the promise of Amendment 64, hospitality is critical. Parental rights, all the other things that we started talking about at the beginning of the show, like that's absolutely and unquestionably critical, and something that I think about all the time is how do we move these concepts forward to fulfill the promise of what Colorado voters voted for in 2012, which is to regulate marijuana like alcohol. Well, if that's what we voted for more than a decade ago, and I still can't go out to a restaurant with my wife and consume, let's not even get into smoking, like consume a beverage with THC in it instead of alcohol. Let's keep it as basic can be. If I can't do that, then we're not regulating like alcohol. So if that was the will of the voters, if that's the goal of what we're trying to accomplish at Strategy 64, 64 and 64, there's a reason that that's the number that's in there, then we've got to focus on those things. So I'm working on that and maybe working on it as more evangelizing every chance I get than, you know, running bills in Colorado at this point, because we don't really do that as much at the firm, except through Colorado Leads, the amazing trade association we work with. And then we're embarking on a white paper project that you and I are going to be collaborating on kind of how the federal government can move forward in a way that addresses the concerns, again, of people who are not supportive or outside the cannabis community. Like, how do we convince them to move forward on a specific model that resolves the differences between various industry factions, but also very critically is like a viable federal regulatory program that's consistent with how the federal government looks at regulating things and can demonstrably be proven to work. So we've been working on that, and that's a project that's getting started in earnest that I'm really excited about, because it started out like a lot of things around here as what I refer to as a crazy Jordan idea, whether that's the Cannabis Policy Institute Symposium, which started out as a crazy Jordan idea where I was like talking to my friend Rihanna and was like, there's nothing for me at MJ Biz. And she's like, yeah, no, there's nothing for us. And I was like, well, I want to make something. And she's like, I want to make something. And I'm like, all right, well, let's make something.
Thanks, Jordan. This is a perfect place to wrap. I hope my baton holding went okay and we can share in the future, maybe see each other again on an episode. That would be great. And listeners, if you'd like to find out more about Jordan, don't forget to check out the WeedWonks Podcast, especially part 1 of this podcast. And if you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to like, subscribe. Next week, we're going to be talking to Eric Berlin of Dentons, big-time Jones Day attorney doing really important national healthcare litigation, turned architect of the modern state-regulated cannabis program. Building on the success of Colorado, as we discussed today, Eric is going to describe how he took that shift eastward and changed the national conversation. Until then, I'm Sabrina Noah, your Lobbyist Lady, reminding you that every policy has a person behind it. Thanks for listening.